August 1st, 1943, 08:47 hours. Operation Tidal Wave, Ploiești, Romania. Major John Riley, flying P-38 Lightning escort fighter, watched in horror as the first wave of B-24 liberators descended toward the oil refineries. 178 bombers, 1,700 men. The most important bombing mission of the war. Target: Ploiești oil fields. Source of 30% of Germany's fuel. Destroy Ploiești. Cripple the German war machine. Simple objective, impossible execution. And Riley's P-38, the fighter designed to protect those bombers, had just developed a fuel transfer failure that would make him witness to one of the greatest disasters in American air combat history. Unable to help, unable to intervene, unable to do anything except watch as the mission collapsed into catastrophe. Because his aircraft, the supposedly superior P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and superior range, had a fatal flaw that Lockheed had known about for months. A flaw they'd documented. A flaw they'd promised to fix. A flaw that on August 1st, 1943, at the worst possible moment, manifested exactly as engineers had predicted. Riley's fuel wouldn't transfer from his external tanks to his main tanks. He had 30 minutes of fuel remaining. The mission would take 4 hours. He would have to abort, would have to turn back, would have to leave 178 bombers without fighter escort over the most heavily defended target in Europe. Not by choice, by mechanical failure, by design flaw, by corporate decision to deploy aircraft before the problem was solved. Riley keyed his radio. "Tidal wave leader, this is Escort 1. I have fuel transfer failure, unable to continue mission, returning to base." The response was silence. Not because they didn't hear, because there was nothing to say. The bombers were committed, flying at treetop level toward targets defended by 243 anti-aircraft guns, without fighter escort, because the fighter that was supposed to protect them had failed before the mission even began. Operation Tidal Wave was conceived in early 1943. Strategic planners identified Ploiești as critical vulnerability. The Romanian oil fields produced 8 million tons of crude oil annually, 30% of Germany's total fuel supply. Fuel for tanks, for aircraft, for ships, for the entire German war machine. Destroy Ploiești, and Germany's mobility would be crippled. Their offensive capabilities reduced. Their ability to wage war fundamentally compromised. The plan was audacious. Fly from North Africa, low level, under German radar, 1,700 miles. Strike the refineries with delayed fuse bombs. Destroy processing facilities. Set fire to storage tanks. Create damage that would take months to repair, maybe years. The mission required B-24 liberators, heavy bombers with sufficient range, 178 aircraft, 1,700 crew members, maximum effort, maximum risk, maximum potential reward. Fighter escort was critical. The route took bombers over heavily defended territory, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, all occupied by Axis forces, all with air defenses, all with fighters ready to intercept. Without escort, the bombers would be massacred. The P-38 Lightning was chosen for escort duty. Twin-engine fighter, long range, heavy armament, theoretically perfect for the mission, but theory and reality diverged. The P-38 had fuel transfer problems. The aircraft carried fuel in multiple tanks, internal tanks in the fuselage, external tanks mounted under the wings. During flight, fuel had to transfer from external tanks to internal tanks as the internal tanks were consumed. Transfer happened through electric fuel pumps, pumps that had been failing, consistently, repeatedly, across the entire P-38 fleet. Lockheed knew about the problem, had received dozens of failure reports, had engineers working on redesigned pumps. But the new pumps weren't ready, wouldn't be ready for months, and Operation Tidal Wave couldn't wait. The mission was scheduled for August 1, 1943. The P-38s would fly with the existing faulty pumps. Mission planners knew the risk, calculated acceptable loss rate, determined that some P-38s would fail, but enough would succeed to provide adequate protection. They were wrong. Major John Riley was 31 years old, from Oregon, lumber mill family. Joined the Army Air Corps in 1940. Fighter pilot training. Commissioned 1941. Deployed to North Africa in 1942. 53 combat missions. 12 confirmed kills. Experienced pilot. Trusted with leading the escort formation for Operation Tidal Wave. 24 P-38s. His job? Protect 178 bombers from German and Romanian fighters. Keep them alive long enough to reach target. Keep them alive long enough to drop bombs. Keep them alive long enough to escape. Simple mission profile. Impossible execution when your aircraft fails. Riley's P-38 developed the fuel transfer failure at 0847. 43 minutes after takeoff. 700 miles from Ploiești. The external tanks still had 400 gallons, but the pumps weren't transferring fuel to internal tanks. Internal tanks were nearly empty. 30 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rate. Not enough to reach target. Not enough to provide escort. Not enough to do anything except turn back or crash. Riley tried the backup transfer system. Manual pumps, hand-operated. Pilot had to physically pump fuel using a lever in the cockpit. Riley pumped. Nothing happened. The backup system was mechanical, connected to the main pumps through linkages. If the electric pumps failed completely, the mechanical system couldn't work either. Design flaw. Single point of failure. The kind of problem that seems obvious in retrospect, but gets missed during development because engineers focus on what should work rather than what can fail. Riley checked his formation. 24 P-38s. How many others had fuel transfer failures? He called out on radio. All escort aircraft report fuel transfer status. Responses came back. Escort 2, transfer normal. Escort 3, transfer failure, returning to base. Escort 4, transfer intermittent. Escort 5, transfer failure, returning to base. Escort 6, transfer normal. The pattern continued. 9 P-38s reported fuel transfer failures. 9 out of 24. 37% failure rate. Not acceptable loss. Not statistical variation. Systemic failure. Design flaw manifesting exactly as predicted. Exactly as Lockheed engineers had warned. Exactly as mission planners had been told might happen, but hoped wouldn't. The 9 P-38s with fuel failures turned back. 15 P-38s continued. 15 fighters to protect 178 bombers. Ratio of 1 fighter to 12 bombers. Inadequate. German fighters operated in groups of 12 to 16. Romanian fighters in groups of 8. With only 15 P-38s, the escort couldn't engage all enemy fighters simultaneously. Some bombers would be unprotected. Some would be attacked without defense. Some would die because the P-38s that should have protected them had fuel pumps that failed. Riley watched his fuel gauge. 20 minutes remaining. He was too far from base to make it back. Would crash somewhere over Yugoslavia, enemy territory. If he survived the crash, he'd be captured. Prisoner of war. Best case scenario. Worst case, killed on impact, or executed by whoever found him. He calculated alternatives. Could he reach neutral Turkey? Possibly. If he pushed the engine to maximum range settings. If he climbed to optimal altitude. If winds were favorable. If he was lucky. He turned southeast, toward Turkey. 300 miles. 20 minutes of fuel. Impossible mathematics. But better than certain death over Yugoslavia. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Wade, followed. Wade's P-38 also had fuel transfer failure. 2 fighters heading for Turkey. 2 fighters abandoning the mission not by choice, but by mechanical failure. 2 pilots who would spend the rest of their lives wondering if their presence could have saved even 1 bomber, could have shot down even 1 German fighter, could have made the difference between mission success and mission disaster. They would never know, because their aircraft failed, because Lockheed deployed faulty fighters, because mission planners accepted unacceptable risk, because in August 1943, the pressure to strike Germany was so intense that flying with known equipment failures seemed acceptable. The bombers reached Ploesti at 12 o'clock hours, without adequate fighter escort. 15 P-38’s tried to defend 178 bombers against 112 German and Romanian fighters, plus 243 anti-aircraft guns. The mathematics were impossible. The first wave of B-24's descended to treetop level, 50 feet above ground, below the minimum elevation of anti-aircraft guns. Smart tactic. Would have worked if the bombers had achieved surprise, but surprise was lost. Romanian radar had detected the formation 200 miles out. Fighters scrambled, gun crews alerted. By the time bombers arrived, every defense was ready, waiting. The B-24's flew into a wall of fire, 88mm flak, 37mm flak, 20mm cannon, machine gun fire from ground positions, fighters attacking from above because the bombers were too low for the P-38's to maneuver effectively below them. The bombers pressed forward, dropped their bombs, delayed fuses. Bombs would explode after the bombers passed, would destroy refineries, would create fires visible from 50 miles away, would accomplish the mission objective, but at catastrophic cost. German fighters focused on damaged bombers, B-24's with engines smoking, with wings shredded, with control surfaces damaged, easy targets, unable to defend, unable to maneuver, unable to escape. The P-38's tried to intervene. 15 fighters against 112 enemy fighters. 4 bombers per fighter to protect. Impossible task. The P-38's engaged. Shot down 11 German fighters. Shot down 6 Romanian fighters. But couldn't be everywhere. Couldn't protect every bomber. Couldn't prevent the slaughter that mathematics made inevitable. When the mission ended, 53 B-24's were destroyed. 33% of the attacking force. 532 crew members killed or captured. 53 aircraft lost to enemy action. But at least 9 could have been saved if the P-38 escort had been complete. 9 P-38's that turned back because of fuel transfer failures. 9 fighters that could have engaged enemy fighters, could have drawn fire away from bombers, could have prevented some losses. How many bombers would have survived with full escort? Impossible to calculate, but more than did. Every pilot who turned back because of fuel transfer failure knew that. Knew that their mechanical failure contributed to bomber losses. Knew that Lockheed's decision to deploy faulty aircraft had consequences measured in dead crew members. Riley reached Turkish airspace with 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Landed at a Turkish military airfield. Aircraft was impounded. Neutral country. Both sides had aircraft land there. Standard procedure. Riley and Wade were interned. Standard procedure. held until end of war, not as prisoners, as guests. Comfortable accommodations, good food, freedom to move around the internment facility, but not free to leave, not free to return to combat, not free to complete their mission. Riley spent the rest of the war in Turkey, watching from the sidelines, reading reports of other missions, other operations, other pilots flying the missions he should have flown, if his fuel pumps had worked, if Lockheed had fixed the problem before Operation Tidal Wave, if mission planners had delayed until the P-38’s were reliable. None of that happened. The mission proceeded with known faulty equipment. The fuel pumps failed at predicted rate, 37%. Exactly as Lockheed engineers had calculated. Exactly as mission planners had been warned. The difference between prediction and reality was that predictions are statistics. Reality is dead crew members. Reality is bombers falling in flames. Reality is pilots sitting in Turkish internment, knowing that their aircraft failed them, knowing that failure cost lives, knowing that someone made decision to proceed despite knowing the risk. After the war, investigation examined Operation Tidal Wave, analyzed losses, determined causes. Fuel transfer failure in P-38’s was identified as contributing factor, not primary cause. The primary cause was inadequate planning, underestimated defenses, poor intelligence about target layout, timing problems that allowed defenders to prepare. But fuel transfer failures made everything worse, made inadequate escort completely insufficient, made difficult mission impossible. The investigation recommended that P-38 fleet be grounded until fuel transfer problem was solved. Recommendation was ignored. The aircraft were needed. The war was urgent. Grounding the entire P-38 fleet would eliminate long-range fighter escort capability completely. Better to fly with known failures than not fly at all. That was the calculation. Cold, pragmatic, necessary in total war, but devastating for pilots who flew faulty aircraft, for crews who died because escort wasn't adequate, for families who received telegrams because fuel pumps failed. Lockheed finally solved the fuel transfer problem in December 1943, 4 months after Operation Tidal Wave. New pump design, more reliable, better redundancy, retrofitted across entire P-38 fleet. The failure rate dropped from 37% to 3%. Still not perfect, but acceptable. The improved P-38’s flew escort missions for the rest of the war. Successful missions. Missions where the fighters didn't fail, where pilots didn't have to turn back, where bombers received protection they needed. But Operation Tidal Wave remained cautionary tale. Reminder of what happens when known equipment failures are accepted because mission urgency overrides safety concerns. Reminder that statistics about acceptable loss rates translate to real human beings dying. Reminder that corporate decisions about when equipment is good enough have consequences measured in lives. Riley was released from Turkish internment in May 1945, after Germany surrendered. He returned to United States, was interviewed about his experience, told investigators about fuel transfer failure, about turning back, about watching the mission proceed without adequate escort, about knowing that bomber crews were dying while he flew to Turkey because his aircraft had failed. The investigator asked if he blamed Lockheed. Riley thought carefully before answering. "I blame the decision to proceed with known faulty equipment. Lockheed identified the problem, reported it, said they needed time to fix it. Someone decided that time wasn't available, that the mission couldn't wait, That acceptable loss rate included accepting fuel pump failures. That someone wasn't Lockheed. That was mission planners, was strategic command, was people who decided that urgency justified risk. Were they wrong? I don't know. Ploesti was destroyed. German fuel production was crippled. The strategic objective was achieved, but 53 bombers were lost. 532 men killed or captured. Was the objective worth the cost? That's not my decision. I was just pilot whose aircraft failed at worst possible moment. Riley never flew combat again. Transferred to training command. Taught new pilots. Emphasized equipment maintenance. Emphasized understanding aircraft systems. Emphasized that pilots need to trust their machines and that trust requires machines to be trustworthy. He died in 1987, 65 years old. Heart attack. His obituary mentioned that he was fighter pilot in World War II, mentioned that he participated in Operation Tidal Wave, didn't mention that he had to abort due to fuel transfer failure, didn't mention that he spent rest of war in Turkish internment, didn't mention that he watched one of the greatest air disasters in American history unfold while being unable to help because his aircraft was mechanically flawed. Those details were in military records, in investigation reports, in Lockheed engineering documents, available to historians, but not part of public memory. Operation Tidal Wave is remembered for its strategic success, for destroying Ploesti, for crippling German fuel production. The 53 lost bombers are remembered as price of victory, as acceptable losses, as statistics in necessary operation. The 9 P-38’s that turned back due to fuel failures are footnote, mentioned in technical analyses, discussed in engineering reviews, but not part of the narrative, not part of the story told about the mission. Because the story of equipment failure is complicated, doesn't fit clean narrative of heroism and sacrifice, raises questions about decisions made, about risks accepted, about whether losses were truly necessary or were preventable with better equipment or different timing. Riley understood that complexity, understood that war requires difficult decisions, requires accepting risks, requires proceeding even when equipment isn't perfect, but also understood that those decisions have costs, that risks manifest as dead crew members. That imperfect equipment means some missions fail, not because of enemy action, but because of friendly failure. That's the real story of Operation Tidal Wave. Not just the bombers that reached target, but the fighters that couldn't protect them. Not just the strategic success, but the tactical failure that made success more costly than necessary. Not just the destroyed refineries, but the destroyed aircraft that should have survived if their escort had been adequate. If the P-38’s hadn't failed, if Lockheed had solved fuel transfer problem before mission launched, if mission planners had waited. None of that happened. The mission proceeded. The aircraft failed. The escorts turned back. The bombers died. The objective was achieved, and 79 years later, we remember the success. We forget the failure. We honor the sacrifice. We ignore the fact that some of that sacrifice was preventable. That's not disrespecting those who died. That's acknowledging that war is complicated, that victory comes with costs, that some costs are necessary, and some costs are result of decisions that prioritize urgency over safety, over reliability, over ensuring that aircraft work before sending them into combat. Operation Tidal Wave. August 1, 1943. 178 B-24 bombers, 24 P-38 fighters, 9 fighters turned back due to fuel transfer failure, 37% failure rate. Exactly as predicted. Exactly as warned. 53 bombers lost. 532 crew members killed or captured. Strategic objective achieved. Ploiești destroyed. German fuel production crippled. But at what cost? Was the cost necessary? Or was it result of proceeding with known faulty equipment? Was it acceptable loss or preventable tragedy? Those questions don't have easy answers. War doesn't allow easy answers. Only difficult decisions, necessary compromises, acceptable risks that manifest as unacceptable losses. Riley knew that. Spent 42 years after the war thinking about it. Never reached conclusion. Never decided if the decision to proceed was right or wrong. Just knew that his aircraft failed. That he turned back. That bombers died without adequate protection. That fuel pumps that Lockheed knew were faulty failed exactly as predicted. That prediction became reality, became tragedy. That's the story. Not heroic, not inspiring, just true. True in the way that war stories often aren't. True in acknowledging that sometimes failure isn't about courage or lack thereof. Sometimes failure is mechanical, is corporate, is strategic decision that accepts known risks. And sometimes those risks manifest as 37% of fighters turning back, as inadequate escort, as bombers falling in flames, as crew members dying because aircraft that should have protected them had fuel pumps that didn't work. August 1st, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave. Sky Combat Failog. P-38 Lightning Fuel Transfer System. Failure rate, 37%. Consequence, inadequate fighter escort. Result, 53 bombers lost. Cost, 532 lives. Lesson. Equipment failures in combat don't just affect the aircraft that fails. They affect everyone depending on that aircraft. Every bomber crew expecting fighter protection. Every strategic planner calculating acceptable losses. Every family receiving telegram. Equipment failure is never just mechanical. It's human. It's fatal. It's reason why good enough is never good enough when lives depend on reliability. Lockheed learned that lesson. Fixed the fuel pumps. 4 months too late for Operation Tidal Wave. Just in time for rest of the war. Better late than never. But not soon enough for the 53 bombers that fell. For the 532 men who died. For the 9 pilots who turned back, knowing that their mechanical failure contributed to tragedy they were powerless to prevent. That's the real story. Not about heroes, about equipment, about decisions, about consequences. About what happens when known failures are accepted because mission can't wait. About what happens when statistics become body counts. About what happens when fuel pumps fail at exactly the wrong moment. Operation Tidal Wave. The mission that succeeded strategically, failed tactically, and taught lesson about equipment reliability that military aviation has never forgotten. Sometimes the most important failures aren't dramatic, aren't caused by enemy action, aren't result of human error. Sometimes failure is just fuel pump that doesn't work. 37% of the time, exactly as predicted, exactly as warned, exactly as devastating as mathematics suggested it would be.